really excited about this journal club, reviewing a research study that was done all the way back in 2017, or just talking about it. It's called The Effects of Velocity Loss During Resistance Training on Athletic Performance, Strength Gains, and Muscle Adaptations. And this research is loaded. Like, this study was absolutely loaded with some fantastic content, output from the research, not without limitations, but let's just get into it here. The study was by, I'm going to say this wrong, Paella Blanco et al., a long list of co-investigators in this from Spain. And so this study, what makes this study so unique is it looked at the and this is not like it doesn't happen in other research, but they're infrequent, is it looked at the interaction between fiber type switching, so muscle fiber type switching. If you're not familiar with that, go back and review some of my videos on fiber typing. And training stimulus, and specifically going to failure, not to failure, keeping in mind strength adaptation. So Andy Galpin, of course, is one of the leading names in the field, and talks a lot muscle fiber typing, hybrids, and those type of things. And he mentions the one sprinter having, I think it was over 20% of type 2X fibers still on board after training. And the conventional wisdom is that type 2 fibers, the most explosive, the dragsters, right? Not the Priuses, which are the type 1s, but like the really fuel inefficient, but man, they're explosive. They get trained out over time in the type 2As. And so what you do is you lose a little bit of the power of the type 2X, but you gain more of the Prius typeness of a type 1. And so you get a trained fiber, right? That is supported by the research literature, taking into account this idea of hybrid fibers as well that are they're hard to classify as one of the 3 fiber types. So, I mean, that's kind of a little background. But what this study did is it looked at velocity-based training. And so looking at the back squat in trained individuals, and I say they're trained because 1.4 times body weight back squat on average. That's pretty good. We'll take it, as a trained individual. Many times people are called trained and they're like a one-time body weight. Well, I wouldn't call that trained. I'd say 1.4 is you're getting there, right? You're definitely getting there. These are males. And so definitely been lifting weights for a predetermined amount of time. I think it was 3 to 5 years was the average. So people have been lifting. That was important to look at who was in the study. And so the conditions is that they had these individuals do velocity-based training at different loads over time, scaling from, let me look at the study real quick. It was in the 60s. I'm talking about percent of 1 RM in the 60s, and then ranging all the way up to 85, let's see here. So it went from 69-ish, 67, ish. Again, there's some up and down here. Getting right on the money is a little bit harder with percentages. All the way up to 85, 84%. So in other words, a good range of percentages over the course of these 16 sessions that were done. And so the way this worked is, and what this was about is the research looked at the barbell velocity at a certain percentage of load, whatever that percentage was determined to be. Like I just mentioned, it was in the 60s or the 80s. Looked at that first rep and looked at the velocity associated, and then tracked the reps of the set with that particular load, and then cut off when the individual stopped the set. So there was no predetermined amount of repetitions. And the cutoff was when there was a drop of 20 or 40% of velocity, of that maximal velocity that was set with the first rep. And so, obviously the 20% group had shorter sets than the 40% group. So 40%, the bar was slowing down, but still fast enough that they didn't terminate the set. And these individuals did not go to failure then. They either went 20 or 40. And then looked at fiber type switching, what kind of fiber type switching occurred with these 2 different groups. And then looked at some strength outputs and hypertrophy outputs associated with doing these 2 different types of hypertrophy or velocity-based training. So kind of the interesting variables here are, how close to failure, what happens when you get closer to failure? Do you get stronger? Or, conventional wisdom for a long time was that you have to go to failure. Do you build more muscle mass by going close to failure? What happens to the fiber typing? So, if you're a sprinter or a weightlifter, Olympic style weightlifter or powerlifter even, do you want to get close to failure? Do you want to stay far away from it? It doesn't matter. If you're 40% or 20% away from failure. And the general summary here is that not going to failure, or staying further away from failure at 20% than 40%, was produced significantly better increases in strength over time than did the 40%. But hypertrophy was better improved by doing the 40% versus the 20%. I can give you the actual numbers, but just take my word for it. There was a significant difference, and I'll post the link to the study as well. You can take a look yourself if you want to kind of go over the details. But interestingly, is the 20% group had less fiber type switching from the type 2X to the type 2A. In other words, they had a greater percentage of type 2X retained from their training than did the 40% group. Okay, so I'm just looking at the data here. In the 20% group was vastus lateralis. They had a drop from 17 plus or minus 7.4. I'm talking about, this is percentage of type 2X fibers, so the really explosive ones. We'd expect this to get detrained, right? Or have less, not detrained, but have less of these fiber types over time, because that's the conventional wisdom for a long time. That any type of training moves type 2Xs to type 2As significantly. And so this particular group, 17 plus or minus 7.4 to 14.8 plus or minus 8.2, that was not significant between those two values. And then the 40 group, 14.6%, so a little bit lower starting value, but cut in half, 7.2%, roughly a similar standard deviation, 8.9 on pre and 7.6 on the post. And that was significantly different. So what does that mean? The closer you go to failure, and this all seems like, of course, but it's cool to see in the research literature that going to failure, while it did produce increases in strength. It's not like it didn't, and it certainly did improve muscle hypertrophy. The amount of strength that was actually increased was better in the group that stayed away from failure, and probably one of the drivers of that increase in strength compared to the groups was the fact that there was less loss of type 2X fibers in the 20% drop-off group than the 40% group. Okay. They also looked at counter movement jump as well, and I circled a bunch of things and made a mess of this thing like I usually do. I wanted to take a look here. By the way, muscle volume, 9% increase versus 3.4% increase in the 40 versus 20 groups. Again, supporting this idea that closer to failure, probably just because there's more volume too. It's hard to distinguish if it was closer to failure that made the difference, like there's metabolic signaling that's going on, which is probably happening as well, or it's just a straight volume. Well, then you could say, well, of course it's straight volume, which is causing the metabolic fatigue, or there's more time under tension than, however we want to frame this. But essentially there's, the further you go into a set, the closer you get to fatigue, the bigger your muscles get. And again, this isn't like, I've never heard that before, or maybe you haven't, and this will be new to you, but this makes sense when we think about the general kind of understanding of how we adapt to resistance training, different types of resistance training. I'm gonna sum all this up to you. If you're like, you've lost me, dude. You're talking about 50 different things. I'm trying to find this table that I had the counter movement jumps in. And I don't want to show you this to you because it's, if you can't get it, it's copyright. I was on the last page, of course. I was so organized, I disorganized myself. When we look at counter movement jump, which they also looked at, there was a non-significant change in the 40 group and a significant change. So the 40 group, so in other words, the 40% drop off, longer sets, more reps, 41 plus or minus 4.3 to 42.5 plus or minus 5.8. So that was a non-significant p-value. And then pre to post in the VL20 group was 40.5 to 44.2. So a significant increase in counter movement jump height, 10 centimeters. Okay. So to summarize, this is why this study is, you're a dork when you you're a nerd when you're like, dude, look at this study. Some people are like, have you seen Netflix? Blah, blah, blah. I'm like, okay. But have you seen this research? This is amazing. Like, this is good stuff. This is when you're a physiology nerd, and strength and coach and all that comes together. But so to highlight, what's the takeaways? Well, things we already kind of know, but it's cool to see some of the conventional wisdom about muscle fiber typing also challenged here. So what this study supports is evidence for is that less volume is not necessarily a good thing for hypertrophy training. well, Dr. Schoenfeld and others are clearly starting to show this. There's not a ton of research to support, but this supports that idea. More volume equals more muscle hypertrophy. But more volume doesn't necessarily mean more gains in strength per se, because there's different types of hypertrophy: sarcoplasmic hypertrophy and myofibrillar hypertrophy. Okay, I don't know how to stumble that word. When you go closer to, or when you go further away from failure, so you terminate a set earlier and keep the movement velocity higher and keep the quality of repetitions higher, you get better strength output. Okay, and there could be some neurological things going on there, of course, but if we look at the morphological changes that are happening in the muscle, what's actually happening to the muscle fiber typing is that muscle fiber type switching that's going on, is there's less loss of type 2X fiber type percentage of the muscle as compared to when we go closer to failure. So it's this continuum of strength, hypertrophy, right? If you were setting up a program, then it would be a horrible idea to go deep into sets and closer to failure, close to a weightlifting competition, sprint, whatever it is. You should be doing lower rep sets as fast as you can move the barbell, which you should be doing anyway in terms of the concentric side, with a reasonable eccentric, a controlled eccentric. Okay. If you're a bodybuilder, then, and you could care less about how strong you are per se, at least during certain times of training, certain blocks, there's a time to get stronger because you can move more load, more tension. But it's all about volume, or at least primarily it's about volume. Okay. And so the deeper you go into a set, the more volume you get. That may be indeed, this article doesn't, necessarily break this down, whether it's metabolic signaling or just more tension and more damage that occurs. Yes, to all that, but that supports this as well. So I think it's an exciting study just because it looks at the muscle fiber type switching and how indeed you can preserve type 2X fibers. And not have them switch to the less powerful but more fatigue resistant type 2A fibers. And as a strength coach and as a weightlifting coach and as a sports coach of any kind, this should also tell you you need to wield that volume sword very carefully. And I'm always keen to talk about volume. It builds and it kills. And when you're going into a competition peaking cycle, again, this is basic training theory, but you can see why it quote unquote works, is keep the volume low, keep the quality high in your movement, keep the bar velocities high, keep your movement velocity high, keep what you're doing all about quality and less about quantity. There can be a time to build muscle mass. There can be a time to add mass potentially on the person. It does produce strength gains, but it'll be primarily, there'll be some suffering that occurs in total strength as a result of building muscle. So you have this trade-off. So you get mass versus, now you get both, but there's less of a return, and it could be fatigue related that's masking some of the strength gains, or it could be that again, we're just seeing different types of muscle hypertrophy occur. So this supports like your linear periodized model, right, where you start with higher volumes and go to lower volumes, and lower intensities go to higher intensities over time, staying away from failure as you get closer to a major competition. If you're in season, don't go to failure unless you have a significant amount of rest to go. And you have to ask yourself, why am I doing this anyway? Is it for work capacity training? Fine. But if you're, say, into sports, your conditioning is probably as good as it's going to get in the middle of the season anyway. And if you're trying to improve it that much more during the season, you're probably going to incur an injury. So that's why you got to prepare before the season. If you're a weightlifter and you're training for a meet, or a power lifter, you don't want to do high volume, high repetition sets. You could do higher volume, total volume, and have, you could have more sets of 20% drops as a way of boosting your volume. But even then you run the risk of, well, you're probably going to run out of reps at some point, because from fatigue set, you're going to not be able to keep up with doing any reps, because that first rep is going to be garbage coming out of the bottom anyway. But if you wanted to take a volume approach, that would probably be a better way to do it than adding more reps per set, because now you're going to get more of that, closer to failure. You're getting deeper into a set with a load, then would probably be a good idea close to a competition, where early in this training cycle might be a good idea. So I think a really interesting study, the fact that there was this bringing in of the muscle fiber type switching, and seeing how preserving type 2X is occurring, and has occurred in other studies, but we never really had a good chance to see the actual fibers switching, because the study was looking at strength and speed alone. But there's this is one of the physiological bases. Of course, it's a physiological basis. This is one of the physiological bases for the trend we see and the quality of reps. So admittedly, when I was, and I'll end with this, when I was a coach early on, I did a lot of failure work in compound movements that I deemed people could do safely. and that was the conventional wisdom. You had to get close to failure in order to build strength. Well, that my view of that started to change over time with one of the studies I reviewed in the Journal Club as well. You can go back and review. I think it was the second one I reviewed. Maybe it was the first one. But also just using my eyes, right? That fatigue is, again, this volume is a good thing, but it has to be wielded very, very carefully. And if we're trying to adapt not just the neurological system, but now we see muscle fiber type, if we're trying to optimize that for a particular strength movement, power movement, it makes sense then to stay far away from fatigue. Stay far away from fatigue. And so this is really cool stuff, supports the velocity-based training. Even if you don't have some way of measuring barbell velocity, if you just use your eyes as a coach, you've been coaching for a while, you can tell when there's that 1 rep switch, and it's usually rep 3. And if you look through the study, it's usually around 2 to 3 reps that somebody has can maintain their bar velocity. They had to terminate the set around 2 to 3 reps when at the 20% threshold, and so that's not a surprise that doubles and triples are going to be your more quality reps. And you start getting past that. Not saying don't. You just got to understand that if you do a set of 4 at the correct load that corresponds to that rep range, let's say 85% or 87 or 87.5, 85%, you're going to incur some fatigue, and you might get a fiber switching starting to occur that you don't want, especially when you're peaking. Okay, I'm starting to talk in circles like I often do. It's just exciting stuff. This is a cool study. I hope you take a look. I think it's fantastic. If you want more journal clubs and other information in the field of exercise, sports science, nutrition science, training theory, subscribe to my channel. Check out some other videos. I got a whole bunch of them. Just having some fun talking about this field that I enjoy. If I don't get in circular conversations with myself. I hope you're enjoying the channel. I hope you're enjoying the videos, and leave a comment below if you have any questions, or if there's a topic you'd like me to talk about. Drop a comment below, and I'll see what I can do about addressing it.